was my first year in Chicago. I've wanted to come for a very long time, and I finally made it here last year. And I did a lecture on kind of transitioning your clinic from analog dentures into digital dentures and the workflows for that. And the biggest feedback that I got was, yes, I want to do this. There's nobody in my lab that knows how to make a denture. Or I don't understand the denture fundamentals. I really want to do this, but I don't know how to actually make a good denture. So this year, what we're going to be talking about is kind of the basic fundamentals of actually making a denture and how we can apply that in a digital software. So I wanted to bring it back to basics, and I wanted to get a little light projector with the little plastic sheets that you can write on, old school. Those are very hard to find, so we're gonna do it with an iPad. So we're gonna do a little bit of PowerPoint, but in between there's gonna be some writing, some drawing, and we're gonna kind of make this a little more interactive as we go through the whole thing. So thank you all for coming today. Let's get into it. So one of the most important lessons I learned from coming from a large lab setting and then working with a denturist for a while, going fully digital, is the question why. Why do we do it this way? And if you're in a lab and you ask, well, why are we doing it this way? The answer is usually, we've always done it this way. And then you kind of just move on with your workflow. And I don't accept that answer. I need to know, well, why are we setting the teeth this way? Why are we trimming our dentures this way? Why are we avoiding these things and not doing these things? And the answer is usually, we've always done it that way. So I want to challenge you here, not just in this show, but the whole LMT as a whole, everything that you're seeing when you walk around the trade show, ask the why. Really, really understand your products, really, really understand your workflows before you try to transition into something new. I was reading a book recently, and I don't know if any of you have heard of Rear Admiral Grace Hopper. She actually was pivotal in bringing computers, like the development of computers, the development of coding. She unified the language of coding. And my favorite quote from her is, the most dangerous phrase in our language is, we've always done it this way. So I really, really want you guys to think about why we're doing things, and maybe think about, can we do it better? Can we talk to our dentist? Can we improve on what we're doing? And go from there. So quickly, what we're going to talk about, we're going to kind of go, honestly, back to the basics, but we're going to look at this in a digital setting. How can we apply this knowledge to a digital software? This will all be based in 3Shape, but all of this information can be easily transferred to an exocad software. We're not going over how to click the buttons. If you want to learn how to click the buttons, I really highly suggest going to the argen.com education website. And we have free webinars that are updated every 2 months. And our really good team goes through how to click all the buttons, how to make it work. But I think you really need to understand why we're making things before we actually learn how to click the buttons, right? Clicking the buttons is the easy part. At the end of this, we will do a 3Shape demo. So I will open the software. I have my computer here, and we'll go through some demos together just to see how we can apply some of the things that we're talking about. So the first thing that you get in your lab, if you're going to be getting anything digital or start digital or get models, is something that you can scan into your software or something that has already been scanned for you. So the very, very first thing before we can do anything is analyzing our data. So in 3Shape, if you are scanning in models, you have a couple options over here. And what you can do is like sculpt your models, basically. So these are already models that have been poured. So we have already gone through the analog process of making sure this is a good impression, pouring this up, scanning this in. What you might get instead is, if this goes to the next slide, there we go. What you might get instead is an intraoral scan. If you get an intraoral scan, now you have a bunch of options to refine this, to trim this, to clean this up. But we need to really understand what we're cleaning up. I would say this is probably going to become one of the more popular items that you're going to get scanned and sent to your lab. There are more and more workflows that are introducing a reference denture with a wash impression. I don't believe that you can get a very good intraoral scan fully edentulous. If you think about it, if you open your mouth and you have no teeth in there, your retromolar pads are now stretched wide open. This tissue back here, right? So if we're now scanning that and your mouth is stretched wide open and we try to put a hard plastic item in there after the fact, that's not a functional impression. That's a static impression of your mouth wide open. That doesn't mean that we can't use digital technology. I still don't think we should be pouring final impressions. Get to your final impression, scan it in. When we scan it in, we need to know what we're looking at. So I have some examples of impressions here from labs over the time, and I would say all of these are not great for different reasons, but these were all final impressions. So we need to understand what is a good final impression and what is a bad final impression, so we know how to trim these impressions, how to make our dentures, how to, unfortunately, make accommodations for bad impressions. But we have to know from the very, very beginning, what are we actually looking at, so we know how to work with it. So some of these impressions here, if you look at these first two, it kind of looks like it's just an alginate impression. Now, the issue with alginate for a final impression is that it sets up pretty quick. So I'm going to talk about border molding in a minute, but if you're trying to capture something functional and you're trying to have them move around and say ooh and ee and ah, that alginate is just going to get smushed around and you're going to end up with something like this first one here. You can see a lot of this has some porosity in it. It's really, really tight here. It's kind of low hanging. You can see here they have some pressure points. So this is probably not going to give you a really good accurate representation of how your patient is going to be moving and functioning, right? This one here, I think we can zoom in. Oh, nice. Look at that. You can see how this is all pushed out. So that means this is overfilled. So their lower is now going to be filled up with impression. They're going to look like they have like dip in their mouth. We don't want that, right? So if we were to just trim this full and leave it like that and leave our dentures full up like that, that's not going to be a functional denture. But being able to read this before you scan your impressions is huge. This one here, again, this is clearly just alginate. I'll zoom out here a bit. There's a lot of pressure points you can see here and here and here. Those aren't accurately being taken as an impression, right? So last year, I had the really fortunate opportunity to go to a suction impression denture course with Marcus Fisher. Marcus Fisher is a Canadian denturist who was trained by Dr. Abe in Japan. If you have not looked into Dr. Abe's impression techniques, I highly, highly suggest it. Even if you are a lab technician, I truly suggest understanding why you trim dentures certain ways. There's a lot of techniques involved on how we can get suction on pretty much everybody's lower denture. And even if they have a super atrophic ridge that's really flat with no bone left, it's still important to do our best to get the best impression we can, right? So I took this course last year. My mind was blown. Like I did know a lot about impressions, but his quality of work is just out of this world. So he gave me some of his photos that I can use today. So this here is Marcus's preliminary impression. This is a prelim. And I know some of you in the laboratory are thinking, this is nicer than the finals that I get. So this is a preliminary impression. And you can see that this is an alginate impression, and he does it in 2 steps. These are also preliminary impressions. So this would be a more digital workflow. And so what he's doing is prelims, and this one here is a preliminary bite. Not a final bite. From this, he's going to make a pin tracer and go from there. But some of the final impressions that I have gotten actually look like this preliminary bite impression. All of this is not captured accurately. This is all excess material that's just kind of sitting there, right? We need to be capturing this tissue accurately. Or if we're working with dentists, we need to know who is capturing it accurately and who is not, so we can make our dentures appropriately. Let's zoom that out. So who here actually understands border molding? As a lab tech, as a denturist, have you guys seen impressions with border molding? Some nods, yes? This is what a border molded impression looks like. So this is step 1. So you're going to take not an alginate, something more slow setting. This is like a PVS type impression material. You're going to put it around the edge. He does a functional post-dam, so he also puts it in the back, which I will talk about in a minute. And once it's in there, he makes his patient go ooh, ee, ah. They move their tongue around. What that's doing is, when you do that, your frenal attachments, your tissue, it's moving around. So we're capturing something hard and plastic in each of those movements. So we can laugh, we can chew, we can blow out birthday candles, because that's always the one you see on the internet. They blow, because nobody goes ooh when they take an impression, and all of a sudden all those frenums push that denture out, which come out onto the birthday cake. So we don't want that. So this is the first step to a border molded impression. Then you go in with another, so you take it out, you go in with another material, put it back in the mouth to capture the rest of the information. And this is what the lower would look like. So I'm not going to get really in depth on the Dr. Abe suction methods. We only have an hour and a half here. We've got a lot of stuff to get through. But one of the most important parts of a lower denture is actually this area here. This area right under your tongue, if that's fully captured, we can now get like a suction technique. That area has to be sealed off. So if you are receiving impressions that have this and your dentist is taking a good impression, you cannot cut off that data. That is extremely important data. Also, a full retromolar pad. I know we don't always get those, but when you do not want to sacrifice any of that valuable data. These impressions take a long time to do, so we want to save and preserve as much as we can. So if I go to the next slide here, this is what it would look like after the fact. So this is complete, a fully finished denture, or sorry, impression. Now at this point, we are not pouring a model. As soon as you pour a model, that is where you are introducing your first step of human error, of inaccuracies. That is where we can introduce the digital technologies. Now, I know I've spoken to a lot of people who say, well, I want fully digital dentures. I'm like, this is still 95% digital. We're just doing a final impression. We can still do the custom tray digitally. You can even take a preliminary intraoral scan in some cases, but the final impressions should still be a final impression. And this is just another example. So you can see here, it looks like this frenum space is pretty wide. That's because he might have a wider frenum, and when you're capturing the lower impression, you have your patient stick your tongue out and move it side to side. And so what that does is it pushes the material around in all the areas where that frenum is going to be moving. It's a functional impression, so they can function with this hunk of plastic in their mouth. So that brings us kind of back to our software. 3Shape, exocad, whatever you're using, you have to trim up your impressions. The really nice thing about trimming impressions, instead of pouring models, is we can, quote unquote, pour our model as high as we want. Like if we wanted to trim it to here, we could do that. We're not going to break any stone off. We're not going to chip the edges off. We don't have any of those limitations that we used to have in the lab, right? We don't have to make this huge giant impression and lock things in and carve them out. No, we've all done that. Here, we can trim it as low or high as we want to trim it. Same here on the lower. Again, we don't want to lose any of this valuable data. We want to keep as much of that as we can if it's a good impression. Now, understanding what a good impression looks like will help you to adjust to a bad impression. So if we know what we want to keep and salvage in a good impression, we can make do sometimes with a bad impression. And I truly believe it is okay to push back on your dentist. It's okay to ask for more data, to ask for a new impression. And not in an impolite way, but maybe in an educational way. Like, hey, I know like a lot of your dentures, you complain we have a lot of remakes or we have a lot of sore spots. Like, I learned this new impression technique. Maybe you should check it out. It's okay to ask for better data. So here's another one with the lower. You can see here we can keep all of this. In the past, we might have had to cut that short or make a really thick, big model, and then we have to do a lot of trimming. If we're scanning it in, we can keep everything we need to keep with no breaking, no chipping, none of that. That's not what I wanted. There we go. So these are our models. After we have trimmed them digitally, this is what we have. So we have full retromolar pads. We have a nice deep sulcus here. We've captured all of that. We have the full roll. He's taken a long time to take a really good impression. I'm not going to cut any of that information short. If this was overextended or overfilled or something like that, this is where I can analyze it. Even on an impression that is definitely overfilled, definitely overextended, I still trim it really high so I can look at my virtual model and make my decisions after that. I'm not trimming my model really short. I'm trimming my denture base short. So what about a posterior palatal seal? This is honestly, when we get into digital dentures, one of the biggest questions that I have. Well, now it's digital. Why are we doing post-dams? Because the original thinking and the original way a lot of us were trained to think is the reason why we're doing a post-dam is because we are now adjusting for that shrinkage in material, right? Because it doesn't, I know, there are some lab techs who say, no, I'm really good at packing. Doesn't matter how good you are at packing, doesn't matter if you're using IvoCap, IvoBase, whatever you're using, you're still going to have some shrinkage because we are changing a liquid and a powder into a solid. It's a chemical reaction. There's no way around it. There's always going to be some percentage of shrinkage. Also, when you're pouring your models, there might be shrinkage there. Also, if you've left your impressions overnight or something like that. So that's kind of in the past why we were trained to do a posterior palatal seal. So then in theory, we shouldn't have to do them digitally because there is no shrinkage. We're either printing or we're milling. And these two products are a lot more accurate than what we can do analog. However, I don't believe that. I believe it's based off of anatomy. If we were to look at different types of the voltage of like how vaulted your palate is, it makes a big difference. So there's actually 3 classes to how vaulted the palate is. So class 1, if you can imagine, has kind of like the ridges here, kind of flat. So this is a side view of our model. Our little tooth will be sitting here. So it's not very vaulted at all. Nice and flat. Maybe they've had a denture for a while, or like some people just naturally don't have a big, deep palate. So if we were to put a suction cup onto a flat piece of glass, it's going to stick, right? And if we look from the back side here, so if this was like where our tuberosities are, this is going to be relatively flat too. So if we take a suction cup and we stick it to a flat piece of glass, it's going to stick decently, right? Now class 3 is a lot more extreme. So if we look from the side, it's going to look a lot more vaulted like this. Here's where our tooth is going to be. If we look from the back, it's going to look a lot more vaulted like this. So typically that is cases where they have like a nice narrow ridge, a triangular ridge. Some people just are born with a lot of bone. And so if you have a super deep palate or a round piece of glass, and you now try to take a suction cup and stick it to it, any little teeny weeny gap of air that gets in there is going to pop it down. It's not always about material. It's not always about shrinkage. So if we're making a denture and we don't want air to get in there, if air gets in there, it's going to push the back part of that upper denture down, correct? So the purpose of your palatal seal is to add a little bit of extra material so that if it pops down a little bit, we have that cushion to stop the air from coming in. So if we have a super vaulted palate and they have, I don't know, really strong muscles or something and it moves just a little bit, that suction is no longer going to stick. So I don't believe that it is a matter of digital or analog. I think we still need to be analyzing the data that we're given. Right? It has to make sense as to why are we doing this. It's not necessarily about materials, it's still about how the tissue works, right? A class 2, for those who are curious, is in between these two. So we have like really flat, really severe, and then something in the middle. So just working with your dentist and finding what works best, but if they have a super deep palate, I still do a palatal seal. So in that case, if we're talking basics, how do we make a posterior palatal seal? I feel like a lot of us maybe weren't fully trained on this and why, like what the sizes are and why we're doing this. Again, we ask the why, correct? So to map this out, let's map this out together. We're going to find the palatine fova. Now this, not every person has. Some of us were trained, find those, that's your landmarks. This one here does, it's these two little dots in the back. Not everybody has that. That is kind of a marker of where your soft and hard tissue ends. So this is also going to be giving us the termination line of our denture. If we go too far back, where that soft tissue is, when you're talking, that soft tissue goes up and down. And so if it goes too far back, now the back of your denture is going to get pushed down. So so now, one, it's going to be uncomfortable. Two, we're moving that denture around and we're getting movement. So it's very important to understand where the termination of our denture should be. So find the palatine fova. If you cannot, find the hamular notches. So that is right behind your tuberosities here. Here's your tuberosities. You have a big bony protrusion here. And it's pretty obvious to see when you start looking at a lot of upper models. You see a nice little round pad there where the bone is kind of higher. Right behind that, you'll see a little dip. That is your hamular notch. And that notch is typically where it ends. If you could put your tongue behind your last tooth and you open and close your mouth a little bit, you'll feel it. And you'll feel it kind of going up and down, the muscle right behind your last tooth. So if we go too far back, that's going to pop that denture down. So we want to make sure we're trimmed right up to that hamular notch. So from there, so we're going to find our hamular notches. You're going to draw a horizontal line. And then it says here, it says mark the midline. So the midline, on this one, you can see it. It's nice and strong. If it is not nice and strong, we're going to base it off of the incisive papilla. The incisive papilla is that little lump right behind your two front teeth. So there's a little lump of tissue that everybody has. It's right behind your two front teeth. And so that should give us a guide. If that's right behind your centrals, that's typically where your midline is. This is just a guide. It's not perfect. And from there, you can kind of go in the middle of that. You can measure the distance between each hamular notch, and you can find your center, if your center line is not obvious to find. And then it says determine soft tissue. So this is kind of like vague, but some impressions you can see the difference. So here you can kind of see the model changes a little bit in this area. You can see how the material looks a little bit different. This was a pretty good impression from a practitioner I was working with. So this one I can tell kind of where the soft tissue ends. So let's draw this out together. I'm going to grab another color here so we can kind of mark out our landmarks, and then we'll draw the posterior palatal seal. So we have our tuberosities here. We have our hamular notches here. We have our midline here. We do have palatine fova here. If you do not have that, that is okay. But the palatine fova, you should be right ahead of it. It's just two little dots kind of in the back of the palate. So we will go in with another color here and we'll draw this out. So this area here, you typically want to be medial of your hamular notch. So that means towards the midline, right? So we're going to come in here in front, something like that. That area should be about 1 millimeter deep, about 1 millimeter wide. That's going to be kind of the most comfortable option, but most practical. If you go more deep than that, it might feel like it's pushing. If it's not deep enough, it might not be effective. And then what we're going to do is mark kind of like 7-ish millimeters here and here. And we're going to taper that up, down, taper this up, down, into a nice butterfly, half of a butterfly. They call it a butterfly because if you can imagine here, you have your butterfly's little body, his little antennas here, and then his little wing on this side. That's why it's called a butterfly. And so this area here needs to be tapered down into the tissue. We don't want a nice hard line there. We want to taper that into the tissue. The whole point of this is to act as like an extra cushion, right? Not just a solid line of material. So we'll taper that in, and then from here, you don't really want to be really deep over the midline. So over the midline, that midline suture can be a little bit firmer, can be a little more hard. So you don't want to have it pushing in too much. It can be uncomfortable. So typically right in the middle there, I don't go as far. So virtually what that looks like, maybe. Sorry guys, I had one on here and it's just not want to show it. I do have one further down, so we'll go over it again when we get there further down. So I will show you again once we get a little down. It's just not showing this slide. Essentially, you don't need to carve it for every single patient, but the ones that you do, you want to make sure that you're carving them the same every time. It's a nice standardized approach that we can teach in our lab, so all of our staff is doing the same thing across the board, right? We can do this digitally, but in the software, I'll be honest, it is a little bit tricky to carve it in by hand. You don't always know how deep it is. Sometimes you get little triangles or something like that. That is okay. I think you should still carve it in the model in the beginning of your model trimming. And then when you get to the virtual wax up, you can turn it upside down and you can clean it up and smooth it. You can do a 2D cross section, which I'll show you. You can check the depth from there. The reason why I still really suggest doing it in the model and not just adding it to your wax up at the end is because on the model we see all of the anatomy. So we can still make sure that we're ending our post stamp at the right spot. So if we're ending it at the right spot, then we can draw our boundary to the right spot, right? If we just draw our boundary willy-nilly and then we go add it at the end, it might not be in the right spot. So functional limits. This is extremely important when we're setting teeth. I'm not going to get into like posterior setups or anterior setups like crazy in depth. We just don't have the time for that. But what I need to really explain is the functional limits. There are rules to when we're setting dentures that are different to crown and bridge. This is a piece of plastic that is not stuck in the bone. So we have to work with it in different ways than we would work with crown and bridge because these are not stuck in the bone. So we have to make sure they can eat, chew, laugh, blow out birthday candles without this moving around. If we get movement, now we get a sore spot. And how do we fix a sore spot? Typically, your practitioner will just grind it out. They're not looking for any other reasons as to why this might be a sore spot. It might be moving because the border's too far back. It might be moving because we didn't cut out a frenum all the way. It might be moving because our teeth are set too wide and now we're wobbling, our forces are distributed wrong, right? So we need to understand these things so we can lower the amount of sore spots because what happens is they'll get a sore spot, they'll go home, it moves some more, they get a sore spot, they grind it out, it moves some more. Eventually they just have this loose fitting denture and they're told this is the best a denture can be, right? I don't believe in that. We can make our dentures better. So functional limits on the upper. There we go. Functional limits on the upper. So when we're talking functional limits on the upper, we're going to start with how far anterior, posterior do we set those teeth? This is assuming we do not have an accurate bite rim or an accurate reference denture. I know some of you come from lab space, and I know sometimes it's hard to get good records. Even when they're using a bite rim, maybe they're just having them bite, and they're getting the vertical dimension, but nothing else. We don't know how far forward. We don't know where the canines might be. Sometimes we don't even know where the midline is. It's just a bite, and that's it. So we need to understand how to read our models to get as close as we possibly can without this information, right? So how far anteriorly are we able to set those teeth before they're out of function? So if they get out of function, that means they're not able to chew, speak, eat, all those things, right? If we set our teeth too far in the front, and I know we have patients that want to push their lip out, they have wrinkles, they want to push it out, suggest Botox, okay? If we're pushing it too far out, now that denture might pop down because we're not allowing the forces in the back to maintain the forces in the front, right? So how far forward can we set these? This depends on the shape of your ridge. If you have a square-shaped ridge, this is really aggressive, but something more square, then the recommendation, which is based off of just looking at hundreds and hundreds of people's teeth and kind of where they sit and the science with the fulcrums. I did not come up with these recommendations. This is from many textbooks. So the recommendations for a square arch is 6 millimeters-ish, around that 6 millimeter mark from the incisive papilla. So we find our incisive papilla here. We mark the center. 6 millimeters ahead of that is typically a general good starting point. Is that perfect? No, but we have no other information to go off of, so we're going to go from there. If you have a rounded kind of tapered ridge, like an in-between, then we're going to go to 7 millimeters. If you have a really tapered ridge, then we can go to 8 millimeters. Again, this is based off of a study of a whole bunch of people's mouths. I didn't make up these numbers. This is from several textbooks. There is, however, a limit. So how far, let's say we want to do that 8 millimeters. We cannot go past the depth of the sulcus here. That is when we start going beyond function. The depth of the sulcus is kind of where your teeth should end. If we go beyond that, we're going to have issues maybe with speech. We're going to have issues with biting into things. Because if you can imagine, now the force, if we bite into something, that force should be going kind of downwards onto the ridge. If it's not, it's going into the sulcus, into the soft tissue. So when we bite down, now we're pushing into soft tissue, and that's going to move our denture. We want to push into the bone as much as we can, right? The other areas that we need to be aware of is for the same idea, you do not want to go beyond the depth of the sulcus in the posterior. Exactly the same idea, we want those forces to be on something solid. So if we're beyond our ridge, way out past the sulcus, when we're chewing and eating, that denture base is going to push into our soft tissue. That's not comfortable, and that's going to allow for movement, which will cause a sore spot, which we're going to grind out, and it leads to all these problems, right? So don't go beyond the depth of the sulcus in the front or in the back. And then typically you don't want to set teeth over the tuberosities. Now, in natural dentition, we do set teeth over the tuberosities, like our teeth are just there. We don't control where they are. But in a denture, you don't want the teeth to be all the way in the back. Typically, if we are setting that far back, it's going to be too far back on the lower. So we'll talk about the lower in a second. But those are the areas that we want to be concerned with. I will bring up 3Shape in a bit and show you how we can check for those areas and see if we are within functional limits. See if we can go to the next slide here. There we go. So our lowers, what are our functional limits for the lowers? The lowers is a little bit easier. We just want to make sure the posteriors are on top of the ridge. When we are chewing, those forces go down, right? So we want to make sure those forces are sitting on something strong, hard, capable to take that. Again, if it's sitting in the sulcus, now we're moving things, it's not going to be comfortable. So you want to make sure you're right on the center of the ridge. So the center fossa of your teeth should be right over the ridge. Now we do have some leniency. Some people have either really big uppers or really small uppers. So we still need to make sure the uppers are within functional limits. Or maybe they have natural teeth and they don't line up. So we have some leniency. And to find that, you have to mark your retromolar pads. So back here, and this is why it's really good to have this in your impression. Back here, everybody has a little soft pad of tissue. And you can almost always find it on a model. Sometimes it looks like a little kidney bean. Once we find that, we can find the most buccal side of that, the most lingual side of that, and I'll grab another color here. And we can make like a little triangle that kind of comes all the way to the anterior here. And we can set within that range. That's still going to be nice and strong enough, nice and sturdy, but that is our limit for the posterior. We don't want to go beyond that when we're setting posterior teeth. If you have a really atrophic ridge, so they have tons of bone loss, they have tons of bone loss and they have a flat ridge, they still have something under there that's going to be a little stronger and a little squishier. So it's still important to find that midline, but it might be a little more difficult. So what you can do is kind of go into the depth-ish of the sulcus on one side, the depth on the other side, measure that distance, and find the midway point. And you can do that all along your ridge, measure the distance, find the midway point, and then just connect those dots. So you still can find the center of the ridge, even if it's really flat, and I still suggest that you do because there's still some bone in there. It's just covered by a lot of tissue. So what about the height of our denture? Like I said before, we might have a really good denture that has a good bite, a good VDO, but how high do we set those teeth? If we set the teeth too high in the lower, when you're chewing and eating, you might not realize it, but your tongue goes over top of your teeth and it scoops out that food naturally. You're not even really thinking about it, right? So if your teeth are set too high and your tongue can't get over there, then you have food and plaque like built up over here, and then you gotta go to the bathroom, you gotta clean your denture, and then dentures are obnoxious and not comfortable, right? So we wanna make sure while they're chewing, they can still clean their mouth like they would with natural teeth. So what is our limit there? How high or low can we set those teeth that way? Again, we're going to find our retromolar pads, and this is going to be our guide. And we have some leeway, so somewhere in between 1/2 to 2/3 is typically where you want it to be. So if we're kind of going here, somewhere between here and here, somewhere between here and here, again, I'm going to go over this in 3 shape as an example, and we can have that anywhere here. So that's how we would find posteriorly, right? But now if we're looking from the side, how high are the anteriors in relation? If we have nothing to go off of, we don't have accurate records, we haven't seen the patient's mouth, typically what you want is to not have a reverse smile. So if this is your anterior and this is your posterior, you don't want it to be going back like this, because as they're talking, you'll just see their posteriors in the back. So find your posterior and then typically set your anteriors relatively flat to that, or the opposite, like downwards, right? We have no other information. We don't know where their lips are. We don't know, so we want to use the best that we can. Obviously, if you have someone that's giving you a good bite rim, set it to where their bite rim is. But we don't always have that information, so we need to know. Even if we have that information, it is okay to call your doctor, or after you've designed it, say, I've designed it to your bite rim, but I want you to know that some of these things are out of functional limits. So where you had your bite rim out, I have set it there, but this might cause movement. This might cause change. It's okay to explain that to our dentist. It's okay to use our knowledge and try to improve our patient outcomes. So even if you have a really good dentist that gives you good records, sometimes maybe they don't notice because they're seeing it in the mouth. They're seeing it from the face. They're not seeing it from a model like we are, right? So it's okay to talk to them and tell them, I've set it to where you want it, but it's outside of functional limits. Can we make some changes? Try it in. Can we see what we can do to get that back inside? So like I said, I'm not going to go really too much into tooth setup. This is a whole other world that we could dive deep into for hours and hours and hours. I highly suggest, if you are new to dentures, do some investigating in a lingualized posterior setup. I really like a lingualized posterior setup. What that means is your lower posterior teeth are a little bit flatter, like a lower degree of teeth. They don't have a lot of cusps. And your upper teeth, the cusps on that, only the lingual cusps are touching. So that force is always going to be driven down, and you're going to have freedom in movement. We're not going to go super in depth in that. Like I said, we could go down a really big rabbit hole with occlusal schemes. So if you want to chat after, please come talk to me. But I will kind of go over anterior, what we're seeing. So anteriorly, it's kind of based on what teeth you're using, what molds you're using. Every company has its own little guide or textbook, but this is generally what we're seeing. Kind of want it fanned out. The nice thing about digital is these setups come in for you. And it is okay to be training new technicians in a digital setting. One of the biggest issues that I heard last year was, I don't have removable staff. I don't have technicians that know dentures. So I started to ask around to the people who do, and I was like, where did you find this person? And the answer was always the same. I hired some guy and I trained him. And it's okay, now that we're coming into digital, I know, there's a lot of us that want to hold on to that and say, well, I burnt all my knuckle hairs off and I don't have fingertips anymore and you need to learn analog. And I don't disagree with that per se, but if we're teaching them foundations and we know how to teach them foundations in a digital space, it's okay. It's okay that they have a setup of teeth that comes in kind of pre-done for them, as long as we're showing them how to make adjustments, how to move things, and why. We need to be explaining why, or they're not going to grasp that, right? They're just going to be clicking buttons. We need to be explaining the why. So that was the uppers. Here's the lowers. Like I said, your teeth will kind of come preset for you. That is dependent on the manufacturer. So if you're using Ivoclar teeth, somebody from Ivoclar has gone into 3Shape or exocad and done a setup to what they believe is the perfect setup. If you're using Dentsply teeth, I don't know, Vita teeth, all the different libraries, somebody from that specific company has gone on and set up the teeth into an ideal setup. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can't make changes, but it is a much easier starting point from analog where we're slapping teeth in there one at a time, right? So it's okay to allow these new generation of technicians to have a little bit easier as long as we're explaining the why. So we'll go through some wax up guidelines, and then I'm going to plug in my computer and we'll go through some 3Shape design and kind of how we can check these functional limits. And again, very rudimentary stuff today. Please come talk to me if you want to go more in depth. So wax ups, these areas here, let's grab some red. These little festoons here, the point of those is to look like the roots of your teeth. So if those are the roots of your teeth, they should be in the direction of your teeth. You don't want to have a canine going this way and the root of your tooth going that way. That doesn't make any sense, right? So we need to be making sure that they're all going the same direction. A wax up doesn't need to be over the top. I know most people in dentistry either went to art school, wanted to go to art school, really like art, really like creating, have excellent hand skills, and sometimes we can get carried away with how over-exaggerated we're making our dentures. It's okay. If you want to make the most beautiful denture, that's okay. It still has to be functional. They have to be able to easily clean these dentures while they're eating and after they're done eating. So you don't want anything to be sticking in these areas. You want it to be nice, smooth, easy to clean. Same here. We don't want a huge divot right there in the wax, which we see a lot in these big, beautiful wax ups. It's a big divot in the upper because it looks cool. It looks like a piece of art. This needs to be functional. We're not displaying these on walls. We're putting these in people's mouths. And if you start to really look at tissue, if you're looking at these crown and bridge photos where they're pulling back and you see the teeth, look at the gums and just look how natural tissue looks. And then I urge you to go look at how these highly characterized dentures look. Sometimes I think, myself included, we get a little overexcited and they're kind of beyond what a natural gingiva might look like, right? So we want these frenums cut here. I do not cut them in the software. This version here for the example I did. In the software, I actually just go straight across, and then afterwards, once it's milled, I will take a disc and cut it out. I find that in the software, if we draw the spline around the frenums, it opens it up too much. It's a little too wide. If it's too wide, and it's no longer just cutting the frenum, we are allowing air to get in there. We're allowing for the suction to come off, right? So we want it to be nice and snug around those frenums so they can move because we have a functional impression of their full movement. If you don't have a functional impression, you will have to cut it a little bit wider so they can move. If they have taken the time when they take the impression to go ooh, ee, ah, blow out your candles, whatever they're going to do, that frenum has moved into all of the motions. So we don't have to cut it extra wide because it's already perfectly set to all of the motions. So here, from a top view, here we go, from a top view, you can see I have some rugae here. This is honestly rugae. There's no true science anywhere that really says if it's good or bad. It's okay either way. Some patients like it, some patients hate it, some dentists want it on every single case. There's nothing wrong with it. Some people might have issues with speech. Some people their tongue might rub on it a lot. Honestly, there's no evidence either way if it's truly beneficial or not. So this is up to you. This area here, you want this to be rounded, smooth. We don't want to have our wax carver, virtual wax carver, carving out a deep pocket because that's just going to build up debris and plaque, right? So we want it to be smooth, rounded, easy for our tongue to clean it, easy to wash it when we're eating and chewing. Now this area here in the front and around these two teeth. That is all your speech. That's all your speech functions there. So if your patients are having trouble saying S, or they're whistling, or your practitioners are saying that their speech isn't there, that's the area that you're going to adjust. You might need to add some more, remove some more. Honestly, these premolars here, these first premolars, if they don't have enough room for their tongue, that's when they can start to say esh and not s. They can't say x, some of those things. So you might have to make more room for their tongue, either by moving those teeth out a little bit or carving the wax back there a little bit. If we look back here, in the back here, we have a muscle here. If you touch your back tooth and you open and close your mouth, there's a big muscle here. And so if we fill that area up, leave it round and bubbly, that muscle is going to be pushing on it. It might push our denture out, or it might just push it in. What do we have now? We have movement. We have sore spots. Your practitioner is not going to adjust that spot. They're going to adjust the underside. It's not really going to fix the root of the problem, right? So we want to make sure that we're carving that out to allow space for that muscle to move and function. And then here on the underside, we have our posterior palatal seal. So this is where you can come in the wax up stage. You can turn it over. I'm going to show you that in 3Shape. And you can smooth it, clean it. You can check the thickness. It's okay if in the beginning, because it's not as easy as carving with your tool digitally. It's not as easy to make it as precise, but this is where we can clean it up. I still say carve it in the model, clean it up in the wax up. All right, looking at the lower, same thing. We want this to be nice and smooth here. We want these to follow the teeth. We don't want to have this interpapillary space here to be cut really, really short, right? We want it to blend nicely up into the teeth so that when they're chewing and eating, everything is clean. So kind of the same with stippling. I'm not opposed to stippling, but if it's really, really deep, then calculus can build up. It can be hard to clean it when you're eating. So it's okay to have some stippling, some little dots to make it look a little natural, but don't go really aggressive with that. If we look on the side here, similar things. On the upper, I didn't point it out, but like upper and lower, I typically do not characterize beyond the second premolar. I don't do festooning. Even the roll around the teeth is nice and smooth. That's where everything's going to build up, and we don't really see that area anyways when they're eating, functioning, right? So we can smooth and blend that area out. So it's going to be really easy to clean that spot. If we look from the back here, this area in here, that is where your tongue sits. We do not want that to be all bulbous and rounded out, because now we're taking away room for our tongue. Your tongue is the strongest muscle in your body. So if we take room away, it's not going to adjust. It's just going to push it out. And you're constantly going to be fighting with pushing your denture out and having enough room for your tongue, for speech, eating, etc. Right? So we want to make sure we're carving that out. We don't want it to be big and round and bulbous. However, if you're going into a milling situation, sometimes it's difficult for the burrs to get that type of concavity. So sometimes in your digital design, you might have to build it up a little bit, knowing that when it comes out of the mill, you can trim it back. So just keep that in mind if you guys are going into milling. I know sometimes in school they're going to teach us this little S here. Should look like an S. And why we're doing that is basically because we're making room for the tongue here. So we're thinning it out there all the way along, and that's what gives you that S shape. So if it has to look like an S, and you ask why, and they don't know, it's because you need room for the tongue there. So if we look at the front side here, I'm going to go to the front here. This area here on the lower, it's similar to the upper. There is a muscle here. The difference is on the lower, you want to be a little bit cautious. If you're taking that out too much, now you have a shelf, right? So depending on the patient, if they're getting a lot of buildup here or food that's sitting kind of on a big divot, you might have to build it up a little bit. So don't go super extreme in the wax ups in that area, but you do want to carve that out for the muscle. So I'm going to just jump over really quick to my laptop. I have it all set up here, and we're going to switch the views to this. We're going to walk through a couple of designs here. One moment. I have everything open, so we are ready to go. This is what your 3Shape software looks like at the tooth setup stage. So this case I have actually preset for us, so we can kind of just go through our functional limits and what that looks like. So what we're going to start with is the upper. When you're setting your digital cases, all of your teeth are kind of going to be referring digitally to where your upper anteriors are. So you want to get your upper anteriors in a decent space. Then your lower posteriors, get those where they need to be. Then we double check where are the upper posteriors now, make sure they're still within function. Lastly, your lower anteriors. So when you're doing analog, everybody has kind of their own method for going through this. Like I set these and then this and then this. Digital, it works best if you're going upper ants, lower posts, upper posts, lower ants. So this case I've already set, so let's check some of our functional limits. So we want to know, all right, we don't have a rim, we don't have a guide, how far anterior should these be, right? So how do we know if this is at that 7 millimeter, 6 millimeter? I would say that this ridge here, if we look at the original model, not in full color. This ridge here is pretty triangular, pretty tapered. So what we're probably in that 7 to 8 millimeter range where we can set those teeth and get a general good setting. So let's pop some teeth on there. And how do we know where that is? There's a tool, which is a 2D cross section, and we can draw a line wherever we want. Now in this 2D cross section, I'm going to blow it up for us a little bit, you can have these grid lines. And these grid lines each are 1 millimeter. So here I can see the edge of my tooth is about here, and then this is the incisive papilla, the center of it here, because I drew that line right in through the incisive papilla. So I can just count. So I'm 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and a little bit millimeters. So that's where I need to be kind of within that range of what's normal. But what about my functional limits? That's just setting it. That's not determining functional limits. Some people can have a tapered ridge but a really tight sulcus, and then we kind of need to adjust, right? So for the functional limits, I'm going to use the same tool. I'm going to turn off my teeth, turn on this 2D cross section, kind of get this out of the way because I don't need that as much, and draw where the depth of the sulcus is. I can move this around here, I can angle this here. You make sure I really have a good line, then turn my teeth on and see where I'm at. So here I can see I'm just pushing that limit. I'm right at it. I don't want to go any further, but I think it'll be okay if I kind of leave it right on there. If my teeth were way beyond that, now I'm way beyond my functional limit, but I have a guide to kind of see where that is. Now what about in the upper posterior? What was the limits here? Well, we don't want to go beyond the depth of the sulcus. Now we can't really determine that until we check the lowers. So the lowers are more important by far. The lowers determine where your posteriors are going to sit. You have to be over the ridge. There is no exceptions. We can make some changes, some exceptions sometimes for the upper, not the lower. You have to be over the ridge. So let's just check our lower out. Let's get rid of this for a second. Check out our lower here. And I'm going to turn on the original. So actually here, I'm going to show you this. In 3Shape, when you, at the very beginning stage, you're making some markings on your model, and then it comes in with these guidelines. Sometimes, even if you set your guidelines perfect, I find that they do come in a little lingual or they're hard to read. So I like to turn on my original model without the guidelines so I can just see my raw data. And again, I'm going to use my magical 2D cross-section tool, and I'm going to draw over the center of the ridge. Now, this tool is cool because I can make sure that it's straight. I can move it around. I'm not dependent on like a computer-generated line. I'm using my own eyes to find where that center of the ridge is. Turn my lower teeth on. Boom, are they over the center? Yeah, they're pretty good. This specific tooth library is a little bit more curved. It's a different style of setup. So generally, we want the teeth to be in the center where this line is. So not bad. And now, if we check both sides, now we can check the upper. So we've moved our lower into the perfect position. Our uppers always move with us in the software. It's nice. They're always stuck together, even if they're not visible. So now we can see, okay, we put those lower posts where they're supposed to be. Now, where are our upper posterior? Are we in a should we be in a crossbite? Are we way too far over? Do we need to squeeze those lowers? Remember we had that triangle of space that we're allowed to use? Do we need to make a minor adjustment? We'll see. So here, if I look from the front, maybe on this side here, I might have to be in a crossbite. So let's check the functional limits of that. Turn on our upper again. Turn this off. We're going to get our 2D cross section here, and we can do multiple planes, but I'm kind of going to go here into ish where the depth of the sulcus is. Let's make sure that's nice and flat. Maybe something like this. Yeah, we don't really want to go beyond the deepest part of the sulcus there. Turn on our teeth and see where we're at. So here, I'm actually okay. So from the front, it might look like we're off the ridge on the one side, but we check our functional limits and we can see we're still within functioning limits. So it's okay on this case. It's a little peeking out right at the back. That's where I might, like, if I can, just tweak that lower in a little bit, still within that triangle, but just bring it in a little bit. If we're way over the ridge and we need to bring those uppers in, now we need to be in a crossbite, right? So now we got to bring just the uppers in, leave the lowers where they are. Now we're in a crossbite. And that's how we would determine if we need to be in a crossbite or not. So then on the lower, typically you just want to check for over the ridge, but for your lower anteriors here, they will be determined by where your upper anteriors are. You want to have about 1 millimeter of overjet. The reason why is because we don't want solid contact all the time. These aren't stuck into our bones. So if we are chewing and talking and we're hitting these all the time, they're going to break, they're going to chip, it's going to be difficult to function. So we need to also be teaching our denture patients, if they're biting into something, they might need to bring their lower jaw forward and bite together on their 2 front teeth. Now some people do that naturally anyways, but when they're just biting in centric, they will not have a contact here. And also, when we go into like a protrusive movement, so if they're going to bring their jaw forward protrusively and bite down, we don't want the backs of those dentures flipping up and down, right? So we can actually turn on our articulator here, and this you can change based on which articulator you're using. This is the Ivoclar example. And we can move our setup. I'm going to visually turn it off, but it's still on here. We can move our setup into a protrusive setup here, and we can have a look. So if we're in protrusive, now we're biting forward. If I turn these teeth up on the upper, you can see I have contacts in the back, which is what we want. As they pull forward, we want stabilizers in the posterior. Otherwise, what can happen is your lowers are just going to flop around, your lower denture. So we want to stabilize that as they come forward. The nice thing is, and this kind of goes into occlusal schemes, which again, we don't have time to get into, but a lot of these cases, the anterior posterior is kind of preset for you in this. So if we're making a lot of individual movements, 1 tooth at a time, that's where we're going to wreck this nice setup that's already done for you. So try to make big movements, moving like blocks of teeth at a time. So I'm going to jump ahead to the wax up. My apologies, it will take a minute to load. I did have this loaded, but you know how it goes. And I have waxed up the upper and the lower, but just half of each side. So you can see how the 3 shape brings it in, and then the minor changes that I typically make when we're waxing up a denture. One more moment. Almost there. This part usually takes a minute to load. All right, so we're just going to look at the wax up here. We're going to move, oh, my articulator is still on. We're going to turn that off, turn off some of these extra settings, and we'll have a look at the wax up. Okay, it's because I've already designed this, so it's trying to apply all of the sculpting that I've already done. Takes a little bit longer. All right, so let's turn off our articulator here, get that out of the way, and we'll go through our wax up. Okay, it's still applying sculpt tools. One moment. Now in 2022, the 3Shape software for 2022, there was some updates made to how they bring the wax up in. If you're in an older version of 3Shape in your lab, the wax ups don't come in quite as nice. You do have to do a little bit more touch-ups and build-ups. The 2022 is pretty good, but it's still not accommodating for all of our functional limits, so we still do need to do some editing. So I'll show you that here. So I'm going to turn off the model, turn this off, turn this off. Okay, so this side on here is how the wax up came in, and this side here is how I edited it. So you can see that it kind of scoops down quite a bit, but I'm not taking away from the thickness here. So what I'm doing is blending it together so we have a nice even transition. If that's scooped out like how aggressive this is here, I want to keep this roll. This is a nice full impression. I don't want to trim this tapered. Again, I urge you to look in the Dr. Abe suction techniques. It kind of goes over all of these, why you want to keep things, the function of it, but I don't want to trim any of that good data away. He's taken a long time to take a functional impression with a border mold. I want to keep that whole border molded roll, right? So all I'm doing is blending this in, adding a little bit in this area here, and blending it down. Now the actual root eminences, if you look at this canine here, the canine is going this way, but the root eminence is going this way. That looks a little weird, right? Our roots typically don't turn at an angle and then go. They're all part of our tooth. So I did edit them a little bit. So this one here you can see is following our tooth. And make sure everything's nice and clean. This is a standard, everyday, normal denture. We don't need to go over the top with characterizing. We can still add these root eminences if we want. We can blend them down a little more if we don't want to. Back here you can see, so here is where it gets a little smaller, and then it's smoothed out. In the very back here you can see I have adjusted a little bit to accommodate for that muscle. Now this case here is a little bit thin here, so I haven't taken a lot away, but as much as I can to make do. Up in here in the posterior, you can see here, right behind the teeth, it tends to carve it out a little aggressively. Sometimes there's a big jump between the canine and the premolar, so we want to blend all that down. Again, this is the area responsible for speech, so if it's way too bulky, there's not enough room for their tongue. If there's not enough space, their tongue won't be able to make some of those important sounds. So when we say T and S, our tongue is hitting the tip of our teeth, behind our teeth, right? They don't have those natural teeth there anymore. They might be in a different position, so their tongue needs that material to be able to speak and function. Here I have added some rugae. The trick for the rugae is you can turn on your upper model and turn your wax up almost invisible, and you can just see where their natural rugae was. And then you can use your add tool and just carve on top here and make it almost exactly the same as what their natural rugae was, right? So it's not always going to be this weird, I know some of us have like a little tin foil matrix thing and we're putting wax in it and we're putting it on. Now we have our rugae. This actually will match the patient's rugae. And if we look at the underside, this is where we can do our post-dam. So you can see the difference here a little bit. I'll zoom in there. This side I've cleaned up. I blended this down a little bit more. I made sure that there's no weird triangles or lumps, because when you're carving it in the software, it can get a little messy sometimes. So cleaned it up, made sure that it wasn't as you can see this side here, it's a little aggressive, a little lumpy. So that's where I'm doing that. And if I wanted to see how deep it was, I could do that 2D cross section. Honestly, the more you do this, you don't really have to measure it every time. But this is about like here. So I'm a little under. Let's go to like here. Again, here we go. And this is where it would terminate here. And you can see I'm kind of at that 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter depth. Those guidelines are each 1 millimeter, right? So that's for the upper. That's the changes that I would make and the difference compared to how it comes in and the editing that I would do. Very minor, 10 minutes max. It's super quick. We don't have to spend hours and hours waxing up. So we'll jump over to the lower. I'll actually just jump this way and go here. And we did something similar here. Move this out of the way. Okay. So on the lower, same thing. I wax up this side, but not this side. So you can see the roll here again. I want to keep all that data, but it's a little aggressive. So I'm basically just blending it and smoothing it. This impression was a little shorter on this side, but you are not smoothing any of this material here. This is extremely valuable when you're doing a suction denture from a good impression. This material should not be trimmed in. That is allowing suction on your lower. It's very, very important. I did carve out a little bit here. So on the back, I waxed up this side. This side came in on 3 shape. So here you can see the difference. I made some room for the tongue here. Just smoothed it in, nothing aggressive. Just smoothed it down a little bit and just blended everything together. The anteriors here too, I find that there's a big jump sometimes between the canine and the premolar. Blended that down together too. So that is all I have for you guys today.